For centuries, the world has celebrated the birth of Jesus Christ on December 25th, but what if that date was never biblically accurate? What if the true timing of Christ's birth was preserved not in the West, but in one of the oldest Christian traditions on earth? In this video, we uncover a hidden timeline locked inside the Ethiopian Bible, ancient calendars, priestly records, and prophetic feast days that challenge everything you thought you knew about Christmas. This is not speculation. It is scripture, history, and sacred timing coming together to reveal forgotten truth about when Jesus was really born and why it matters more than most people realize. Before we dive into this eye-opening journey, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who loves truth beyond tradition. Let's uncover what history never meant to forget. Every year, billions around the world mark December 25th as the day Christ was born, decorating homes, singing carols, and retelling a familiar nativity story. Yet, beneath these beloved traditions lies a serious historical and theological question that few are encouraged to ask: was Jesus truly born on December 25th? And if not, why has that date become so universally accepted? This is where the Ethiopian Bible enters the conversation, offering a perspective that challenges Western assumptions and invites us into a deeper, older, and more historically grounded understanding of Christ's birth. The Ethiopian Bible, also known as the Ethiopic Scriptures or the Gia's Bible, is the oldest complete Christian Bible still in existence today. Unlike the Western canon, which contains 66 books in Protestant tradition and 73 in Catholic usage, the Ethiopian Bible contains 81 books. Some of these texts were removed, disputed, or lost in the West, yet preserved intact in Ethiopia. This alone raises an important question: what other truths may have been preserved in Ethiopia that the rest of the world overlooked, misunderstood, or deliberately set aside? Ethiopia occupies a unique place in biblical history. It is mentioned repeatedly throughout Scripture, often associated with wisdom, royalty, faith, and divine favor. From the Queen of Sheba's encounter with King Solomon to the Ethiopian eunuch baptized by Philip in the book of Acts, Ethiopia appears not as a peripheral nation, but as a spiritual custodian. Christianity did not arrive in Ethiopia through European missionaries centuries later. It was established as a state religion in the 4th century, making Ethiopia one of the oldest Christian nations on earth. This uninterrupted spiritual lineage allowed Ethiopian scholars to preserve ancient manuscripts, calendars, and traditions without the political interference that shaped Western Christianity. One of the most striking differences between Ethiopian Christianity and Western Christianity is the calendar. Ethiopia does not follow the Gregorian calendar used by most of the world today. Instead, it follows an ancient calendar system with 13 months and different calculations for dates, seasons, and holy days. This calendar is not merely cultural. It is deeply theological. Ethiopian feast days, fasts, and sacred commemorations are tied to scriptural interpretations that predate Roman influence. When applied to the birth of Christ, this calendar produces a very different conclusion from the December 25th tradition. To understand why December 25th became dominant, we must briefly address Roman history. Long before Christianity was legalized, December 25th was already celebrated across the Roman Empire as the Feast of Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun. This festival marked the winter solstice, when days began to grow longer again. When Emperor Constantine converted to Christianity in the 4th century, he faced the challenge of unifying a religiously diverse empire. One strategy was syncretism, merging Christian observances with existing pagan festivals. Over time, the birth of Christ was assigned to December 25th. Not because of scriptural evidence, but because it aligned with established imperial celebrations. The Ethiopian Church, however, was never under Roman control in the same way. It did not need to accommodate pagan festivals or imperial politics. As a result, it retained older calculations rooted in Jewish customs, priestly courses, and astronomical markers described in Scripture. Ethiopian scholars examined the Gospel accounts with attention to detail, particularly the timing of Zechariah's priestly service, the conception of John the Baptist, and the seasonal activities mentioned in the nativity narratives. These details matter because Scripture does not present Christ's birth as a mythic event floating outside time. It anchors it in history, geography, and ritual precision. The Gospels of Matthew and Luke provide subtle but important clues. Luke tells us that shepherds were in the fields watching their flocks by night. In Judea, this practice occurred during specific seasons, not during the cold, rainy winter months of December. Ethiopian scholars took such details seriously. They cross-referenced them with Jewish temple schedules preserved in ancient texts and aligned them with Ethiopia's own ancient calendar. The result is a birth time frame that falls nowhere near December 25th. This raises another crucial issue. Why has the Ethiopian perspective been marginalized or ignored in mainstream Christian teaching? Part of the answer lies in power and narrative control. Western Christianity developed alongside empire, colonization, and theological gatekeeping. Texts that challenged dominant interpretations were often labeled apocryphal, heretical, or culturally irrelevant. African Christianity, despite its antiquity, was frequently portrayed as secondary or derivative, rather than foundational. Yet historically, Ethiopia preserved Christian doctrine while Europe was still emerging from paganism. The purpose of this video is not to dismantle faith, but to deepen it. Understanding the real birthday of Jesus does not diminish his divinity or his mission. Instead, it restores historical integrity and honors the cultures that safeguarded sacred knowledge when others altered it. Truth does not fear investigation. If Christ is the truth, then uncovering the historical reality of his birth only strengthens our confidence in Scripture. In this first section, we have laid the foundation, the uniqueness of the Ethiopian Bible, the historical roots of Ethiopian Christianity, the problem with December 25th, and the importance of examining Scripture without imperial filters. In the next section, we will move deeper into the biblical evidence itself, tracing priestly timelines, angelic visitations, and calendar calculations that point us toward a far more precise and compelling date for the birth of Jesus Christ. As we move forward from the historical foundations laid in the first section, we now turn directly to the biblical text itself. The Scriptures do not give us a calendar date for the birth of Jesus, but they provide something far more valuable: timelines. When read carefully, these timelines form a coherent sequence that allows us to narrow down the season and ultimately the likely date of Christ's birth. The Ethiopian tradition does not speculate emotionally or symbolically. It calculates meticulously, beginning with the conception of John the Baptist. The Gospel of Luke opens the birth narrative not with Mary, but with Zechariah. This detail is intentional and critical. Luke 1 tells us that Zechariah was a priest of the division of Abijah, serving in the temple when the angel Gabriel appeared to him. This single verse unlocks an entire chronological framework because the priestly divisions were strictly organized and meticulously recorded in Jewish tradition. There were 24 priestly courses, established in the time of King David, and each course served in the temple for 1 week, twice a year, in a fixed rotation. The division of Abijah was the 8th course. According to historical Jewish records, the priestly year began in the month of Nisan, which corresponds roughly to March-April in the modern calendar. Counting forward, the 8th course would serve around late May to early June. This timing is crucial because Luke tells us that after Zechariah completed his service, he returned home and Elizabeth conceived. Scripture is precise. The conception of John the Baptist occurred shortly after Zechariah's temple duty. Luke then tells us that in the 6th month of Elizabeth's pregnancy, the angel Gabriel was sent to Mary to announce the conception of Jesus. This gives us a measurable interval. If John was conceived around late May or early June, 6 months later places Gabriel's visit to Mary around November or December. This means Jesus was conceived in late autumn or early winter, not born, but conceived. From here, the timeline continues naturally. A normal human pregnancy lasts approximately 9 months. Counting forward from a late November or early December conception places the birth of Jesus around late August or September. This timeframe aligns remarkably well with several details in the Gospel accounts that December 25th does not. One of the most overlooked clues is the presence of shepherds in the fields at night. In Judea, shepherds brought their flocks indoors during the cold and rainy winter months. December nights were not spent outdoors guarding sheep. That practice belonged to late summer and early autumn. This late summer to early autumn birth also aligns with Jewish feast cycles. Ethiopian scholars have long noted the symbolic significance of Jesus being born around the Feast of Tabernacles, known as Sukkot. This feast celebrates God dwelling among his people, a theme powerfully echoed in John 1:14. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. The word dwelt literally means tabernacled. This connection is not poetic coincidence. It reflects theological intentionality embedded in sacred timing. The Ethiopian Bible preserves additional calendrical insights that strengthen this conclusion. Ethiopian Christianity retained ancient Jewish calendar calculations that were lost or ignored in the West after the destruction of the Second Temple. These calculations preserve the continuity between priestly service, feast days, and prophetic fulfillment. From this perspective, Christ's birth is not randomly assigned but divinely orchestrated to coincide with sacred seasons that reveal his identity. Another important detail often overlooked is the Roman census mentioned in Luke 2. This census required people to travel to their ancestral homes. Such mass movement would have been impractical during the winter months when roads were muddy, dangerous, and often impassable. Roman administrative practice typically scheduled censuses during more favorable seasons. A late summer or early autumn census aligns far more realistically with historical logistics. When we place all these pieces together, the priestly course of Abijah, the conception of John the Baptist, the 6-month interval before Mary's Annunciation, the gestation period, the shepherds in the fields, the census logistics, and the alignment with Jewish feast days, a consistent picture emerges. The Bible itself points away from December 25th. This is not speculation. It is sequential reasoning rooted in the text. So why were these details overlooked in Western Christianity? Partly because theological focus shifted away from Hebrew roots and toward Greco-Roman frameworks. As Christianity expanded into Europe, its Jewish context was increasingly downplayed. The Ethiopian Church, however, maintained continuity with both Old Testament structure and New Testament fulfillment. This allowed Ethiopian scholars to read Luke's Gospel not as isolated verses, but as a chronological narrative embedded in Jewish religious life. It is important to emphasize that uncovering the likely timing of Jesus' birth does not undermine Christian faith. On the contrary, it strengthens it. It shows that Scripture is internally consistent, historically grounded, and intentionally structured. The Ethiopian perspective reminds us that the Bible was written by people who lived in real seasons, followed real calendars, and worshipped within real ritual rhythms. As this section draws to a close, we stand at a pivotal point. We have followed the biblical timeline from temple service to conception to birth, and we have seen how consistently it points to a late summer or early autumn arrival of Christ. In the next section, we will explore how the Ethiopian calendar, feast theology, and prophetic symbolism converge to suggest not only the season of Jesus' birth, but a remarkably specific time frame that carries profound theological meaning. Having established the biblical timeline in the previous section, we now move into the heart of the Ethiopian tradition itself, the calendar. This is where the discussion shifts from general seasonality to prophetic precision. The Ethiopian calendar is not simply an alternative way of counting days. It is a theological framework rooted in ancient Jewish reckoning, preserved without Roman or medieval European alteration. When applied to the life of Christ, it reveals a pattern that is both historically coherent and spiritually profound. The Ethiopian calendar consists of 13 months, 12 months of 30 days, and a 13th month of 5 or 6 days, depending on the leap year. More importantly, it calculates years differently from the Gregorian calendar, placing the birth of Christ approximately 7 to 8 years later than Western dating systems. This discrepancy alone signals that Ethiopian Christianity never fully accepted Western chronologies as authoritative. Instead, it relied on internal scriptural alignment and inherited tradition. Within this calendar system, Ethiopian Christianity places significant emphasis on the alignment between divine events and sacred feasts. God, in Scripture, does not act randomly. He works within appointed times. These appointed times, modem in Hebrew, are not merely Jewish festivals. They are prophetic markers. Each feast reveals something about God's redemptive plan. Ethiopian scholars understood that if Jesus fulfilled prophecy in his death during Passover and in the outpouring of the Spirit during Pentecost, then his birth would also align with a sacred appointment. This brings us again to the Feast of Tabernacles. In Ethiopian tradition, this feast carries exceptional weight. Tabernacles commemorates God dwelling among Israel in the wilderness, living in temporary shelters with his people. It is a feast of presence, joy, light, and divine closeness. Ethiopian theologians recognize that no feast better symbolizes the incarnation than this one. God did not merely visit humanity. He dwelt among us. When the Ethiopian calendar calculations are applied to the conception timeline we explored earlier, the birth of Jesus aligns closely with the period corresponding to Tabernacles. This is not a vague seasonal overlap. Ethiopian tradition places the Nativity in early autumn, during a time of pilgrimage, celebration, and communal gathering. This also explains why Bethlehem was crowded, requiring Mary and Joseph to seek shelter elsewhere. Pilgrimage feasts brought massive population movement, far beyond what a census alone would require. The symbolism deepens further when we consider light imagery. Tabernacles was known as the Festival of Light, marked by the illumination of large lamps in Jerusalem. Jesus later declared, "I am the light of the world." Ethiopian scholars saw this not as coincidence, but continuity. Christ's identity as light entering the world aligns far more powerfully with a feast centered on illumination than with the darkness of the winter solstice. Another often overlooked aspect is agricultural context. Tabernacles coincides with harvest season, a time of abundance, rejoicing, and thanksgiving. Shepherds would indeed be in the fields during this period, watching over flocks that grazed on post-harvest stubble. This detail harmonizes perfectly with Luke's account and stands in sharp contrast to December, when fields were cold, barren, and unsuitable for night grazing. Ethiopian theology also connects Christ's birth to prophetic cycles found in the Book of Jubilees and other texts preserved in the Ethiopian canon. These writings emphasize divine order in time, cycles of sevens, and appointed seasons. While these texts were removed or marginalized in Western Christianity, Ethiopia preserved them as complementary witnesses. They reinforce the idea that messianic events occur on divinely chosen dates, not arbitrarily assigned ones. This brings us to an uncomfortable but necessary question. If the Ethiopian calendar and biblical symbolism point so clearly away from December 25th, why does that date persist so strongly? The answer lies less in theology and more in tradition. Over centuries, repetition replaced investigation. What began as a pragmatic compromise in the Roman Empire hardened into unquestioned orthodoxy. Over time, December 25th became emotionally entrenched, even as its historical foundations remained fragile. Ethiopian Christianity, existing largely outside this Western development, had no need to revise its sacred calendar to accommodate empire or assimilation. Its feasts remained tied to scripture, not to political expediency. As a result, Ethiopian believers celebrated Christ's incarnation not as a winter event, but as a fulfillment of divine dwelling, God tabernacling with humanity. It is important to stress that Ethiopian Christians do celebrate the birth of Christ. The difference is not whether they honor it, but how and when. Their celebration is quieter, more reverent, more liturgically grounded. It emphasizes mystery over spectacle, alignment over pageantry. This posture reflects a theology that values continuity with ancient faith over conformity to global norms. As we reach the end of this section, the picture becomes clearer. The Ethiopian calendar does not merely challenge December 25th. It offers a coherent alternative rooted in scripture, symbolism, and sacred time. Christ's birth emerges not as an isolated event, but as part of a divine rhythm that spans covenants, feasts, and prophetic fulfillment. In the next section, we will confront the Western tradition directly. We will examine how December 25th became dominant, the theological compromises involved, and what was lost when historical accuracy gave way to institutional convenience. This contrast will sharpen our understanding of why the Ethiopian witness matters now more than ever. With the Ethiopian calendar and prophetic framework now clearly established, we turn our attention to the Western tradition that shaped global Christianity's understanding of Jesus' birth. December 25th did not emerge from careful biblical study or apostolic instruction. Instead, it arose from a convergence of politics, culture, and religious compromise. Understanding how this date became dominant is essential, not to assign blame, but to recognize how historical forces can reshape sacred truth. In the earliest centuries of Christianity, believers did not celebrate the birth of Jesus at all. Early Christians were far more focused on his death and resurrection, which they understood as the core of salvation. There was no consensus on a birth date, and various communities proposed different times of year. Some suggested spring, others autumn. December 25th was not among the earliest suggestions. This silence is telling. If the apostles had regarded Christ's birthday as essential, it would have been preserved explicitly in scripture or early tradition. Everything changed in the 4th century with the rise of Emperor Constantine. As Christianity transitioned from a persecuted faith to an imperial religion, it inherited new responsibilities and new compromises. Constantine sought unity across a vast and religiously diverse empire. Pagan festivals were deeply embedded in Roman life, particularly those connected to the sun, seasonal cycles, and imperial ideology. Among the most popular was the festival of Sol Invictus, celebrated on December 25th, marking the rebirth of the sun after the winter solstice. Rather than abolishing these celebrations outright, church leaders found it more expedient to reinterpret them. The birth of the unconquered sun became the birth of the Son of Righteousness. This linguistic and symbolic overlap made the transition easier for pagan converts, but it came at a cost. The date was not chosen because scripture pointed to it, but because culture demanded continuity. Over time, this pragmatic decision hardened into dogma. The Ethiopian Church, existing outside Roman jurisdiction, never faced this pressure. It did not need to Christianize pagan festivals because it was not governing a pagan empire. As a result, it preserved a calendar that remained faithful to biblical patterns rather than imperial convenience. This divergence explains why Ethiopian Christianity retained a different understanding of Christ's birth while the West moved in another direction. As December 25th gained prominence, theological emphasis began to shift. The incarnation became associated with winter imagery, darkness pierced by light, cold transformed by warmth. While these metaphors are powerful, they are not biblical necessities. Over time, symbolism replaced chronology. The story of Jesus' birth became increasingly detached from Jewish context, feast cycles, and historical setting. What was gained in emotional resonance was lost in historical precision. Medieval Christianity further entrenched December 25th through liturgy, art, and tradition. Nativity scenes, carols, and feast days reinforced the date across generations. By the time of the Reformation, the question of Christ's birth date was no longer considered open for discussion. Reformers challenged many doctrines, but they rarely questioned inherited calendars. December 25th had become Christian by repetition, not by revelation. Colonial expansion then exported this tradition globally. As European powers spread Christianity across Africa, Asia, and the Americas, they also imposed their calendars. Indigenous Christian expressions, including Ethiopian Christianity, were marginalized or portrayed as exotic exceptions rather than authoritative witnesses. The irony is profound. One of the oldest Christian traditions in the world was treated as peripheral by much younger institutions. What was lost in this process was not merely a date, but a way of reading scripture. Western Christianity gradually moved away from Hebraic thinking toward Greco-Roman abstraction. Time became linear rather than cyclical, feasts became symbolic rather than prophetic, and biblical events were separated from agricultural and ritual rhythms. The Ethiopian tradition preserved what the West forgot, that God acts within time deliberately. This loss has practical consequences. When sacred history is detached from real calendars, it becomes easier to mythologize faith rather than embody it. Christianity risks becoming a collection of symbols rather than a lived, historical reality. The Ethiopian witness calls us back to grounded faith, one that honors both mystery and materiality. It is important to clarify that acknowledging these historical developments does not invalidate Western Christianity. Faith is not dependent on perfect calendars. Millions have encountered Christ genuinely through December 25th celebrations. God meets people where they are. However, acknowledging God's grace does not require ignoring historical truth. Two things can be true at once. Christ can be honored sincerely on December 25th, and that date can still be historically inaccurate. The question, then, is not whether people should stop celebrating Christmas, but whether they are willing to separate tradition from truth. Ethiopian Christianity offers a corrective, not an attack. It reminds the global church that faith did not begin in Europe, that scripture did not emerge from empire, and that ancient voices still deserve to be heard. As we conclude this section, the contrast is clear. December 25th arose from accommodation. The Ethiopian understanding arose from continuity. One prioritized cultural unity. The other preserved biblical alignment. In the final section, we will explore why this truth matters today, spiritually, culturally, and prophetically, and how recovering the real timing of Christ's birth can renew our understanding of his mission and identity in the modern world. As we arrive at the final section of this study, the question before us is no longer merely historical. It is spiritual, cultural, and prophetic. If the Ethiopian Bible and ancient biblical timelines point away from December 25th and toward an early autumn birth of Jesus Christ, why does this matter now? What difference does it make in the life of a modern believer? The answer is deeper than dates and calendars. It speaks to identity, truth, and the way we relate to Scripture itself. First, Understanding the real timing of Jesus' birth restores historical integrity to the gospel narrative. Christianity is not a mythological religion built on abstract ideas. It is rooted in real events that occurred in real places at real times. When believers accept inherited traditions without examination, faith risks becoming sentimental rather than substantial. The Ethiopian witness reminds us that God entered human history intentionally, not symbolically. Christ was born within a specific season for a reason, and that reason reveals something about his mission. When Jesus was born during a pilgrimage feast season, likely around Tabernacles, it means his arrival coincided with themes of divine presence, joy, harvest, and dwelling. This reframes the incarnation. Christ did not simply come to rescue humanity from sin. He came to live among humanity. The message is not only redemption, but restoration, God returning to dwell with his creation. This understanding deepens theology and enriches worship. Second, recovering this truth challenges the dominance of Eurocentric Christianity. For centuries, global Christianity has been taught through a Western lens, often presented as universal and unquestionable. The Ethiopian Bible disrupts that narrative. It reminds us that Christianity is not owned by one culture, continent, or empire. Africa was not a late recipient of the gospel. It was an early custodian. Acknowledging this truth restores dignity to African Christianity and corrects historical imbalance. This matters profoundly in a world still shaped by the legacy of colonization. Many believers inherited not only faith, but also distorted narratives about where faith comes from and who holds authority over interpretation. When the Ethiopian tradition is taken seriously, it decentralizes power and recenters scripture. Truth is no longer filtered exclusively through Rome, Canterbury, or Geneva, but through Jerusalem, Ethiopia, and the ancient Near East. Third, understanding the real birthday of Jesus invites believers to rethink tradition without fear. Too often, questioning inherited practices is seen as threatening faith. But biblical faith has always involved wrestling, inquiry, and refinement. Abraham questioned, Moses questioned, the prophets questioned, and the apostles debated. Truth withstands scrutiny. The Ethiopian tradition models a faith that honors scripture more than custom. This does not mean rejecting Christmas celebrations outright. It means holding them honestly. One can celebrate December 25th culturally while recognizing that it may not be historically accurate. The danger lies not in celebration, but in confusion, when tradition is mistaken for revelation. Separating the two frees believers to worship with clarity and maturity. Fourth, this revelation has prophetic implications. Scripture repeatedly emphasizes appointed times. Jesus fulfilled Passover through his death, first fruits through his resurrection, and Pentecost through the outpouring of the Spirit. These were not random alignments. They were precise fulfillments. If his birth also aligned with the feast, particularly Tabernacles, then it reinforces the idea that God operates according to divine schedules. This has implications for how believers understand prophecy today. It encourages attentiveness to biblical patterns rather than sensational speculation. The Ethiopian approach is sober, disciplined, and rooted in Scripture. It does not chase novelty. It preserves continuity. In an age of misinformation and spiritual distraction, this grounded posture is desperately needed. Fifth, reclaiming this truth reorients worship away from consumerism. Modern Christmas culture is dominated by excess, commerce, and performance. While generosity and joy are not inherently wrong, they often overshadow contemplation and reverence. The Ethiopian celebration of Christ's birth is quieter, more liturgical, more inward. It focuses on mystery rather than spectacle. Knowing that Jesus was likely born during a feast that emphasized God's presence reframes worship as encounter rather than entertainment. It reminds believers that the incarnation calls for humility, obedience, and transformation, not merely seasonal excitement. Finally, this truth matters because it invites believers into deeper discipleship. Christianity was never meant to be inherited unexamined. Each generation is called to engage Scripture afresh, anchored in truth but open to correction. The Ethiopian Bible does not demand blind acceptance. It invites serious study. The goal of this video has not been to provoke controversy, but to awaken curiosity. If the real birthday of Jesus is different from what many were taught, that does not weaken faith, it strengthens it. It proves that Scripture contains layers of meaning waiting to be uncovered by those willing to look closely. Jesus himself said that truth sets people free. Freedom begins with honesty, about history, about tradition, and about ourselves. The Ethiopian witness stands as a reminder that ancient faith still speaks, that marginalized voices still carry wisdom, and that God's truth is larger than any single tradition. As this study concludes, one thing becomes clear. The question is not whether Jesus was born on December 25th, but whether believers are willing to follow truth wherever it leads. The Ethiopian Bible offers not a threat, but a gift, an invitation to rediscover Christ not through empire-shaped tradition, but through scripture, history, and sacred time. If this exploration has challenged you, let it also deepen you. Study further, read scripture more carefully, honor tradition, but love truth more. And above all, remember that the greatest miracle is not the date of Christ's birth, but the reality that God chose to dwell with humanity at all. As we conclude this journey, one truth stands unmistakably clear: the story of Jesus Christ is far richer, deeper, and more intentional than tradition alone has allowed us to see. The Ethiopian Bible, ancient calendars, and biblical timelines do not diminish Christ, they magnify him. They reveal a God who moves with purpose, fulfills prophecy with precision, and enters human history at appointed times. Rediscovering the likely season of Jesus' birth is not about correcting a date. It is about restoring context, honoring ancient faith, and awakening a deeper reverence for Scripture. When truth is recovered, faith is strengthened, not shaken. If this message expanded your understanding or challenged long-held assumptions, don't keep it to yourself. Like this video, subscribe to the channel for more uncovering biblical insights, share it with others seeking truth beyond tradition, and drop a comment below. We'd love to hear what stood out to you most.